Perfect. Having technical moments there. I couldn't unmute my mic. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is DeAngela Burns-Wallace. I am the Secretary of the Department of Administration, and I am working with the Kansas Office of Recovery out of the Governor's Office. With that, I am going to get us kicked off today and start our conversation. It looks like we have a little bit over 100 people joining us, great, from all over the state. I'm going to start our conversation, and a few of you may have joined us a couple of weeks back. And then I'm actually going to turn it over to a few partners to walk us through some of the guidance and carry the conversation. So with that, I'm going to ask for us to get started. And so if we can progress the slides for me. All right. So just a few things to get us started today. There's a lot that is coming in the next couple of weeks. We received some information so far. I know many of you have probably dived into the interim final rule document, which was issued last Monday. The guidance is effective, but what I will tell you is that there is still a comment and question period that goes through July 10. So we continue to collect thoughts, questions, send those back to Treasury through conversations today and future conversations. We will continue to do so. And what that does is we may see small modifications in that guidance going forward. So it's important that we continue to have these conversations and understand what questions are coming up and try to make sure that we're pushing any additional questions back to Washington for clarification. There is also pieces of that guidance that you can see even as you read through it that says more to come. And we will be watching that. So one example is the capital projects. There's not as much information there as to how to apply, when to apply, things of that nature. So we should anticipate that there are more pieces of guidance that'll be coming out over time. What we do know is that local governments will have direct fiduciary responsibility with Treasury. So, and we also know, of course, that the counties and the major metropolitan cities can apply now. So as we push that information out last week, encouraging to go in, do so, and we'll walk through some of those pieces here today again. We know that the information around the non-entitlement units of local government is still pending. We still haven't seen the official list. And so as that, we are monitoring on a daily basis and we'll continue to walk through that. What I will tell you, and some of what we'll go through today, is that most importantly that the Governor's Office of Recovery, we are still committed to a level of support to be helpful, even though we don't have that direct fiduciary responsibility relationship with the counties and the metropolitan cities like we had under CRF. Our goal today is, one, to help just provide an interpretation of some of the guidance. For two, to share with you some of the support that we're hoping to continue to put in place, and then to think about kind of future timetables, next steps, and to make sure that we are giving time for questions and answers. With that, and along the way, identify a few key milestones and things of that nature. Again, just so that we're level setting a little bit. As we prepare for more and more information to come, as we prepare to try to answer questions from our stakeholders, your stakeholders across the state. So with that, I am going to, if I can advance the slide. All right, one more for me. So as you all know, just that big picture, making sure that we're all starting from that same foundational space. Remember that overall, like the state will be receiving just under 1.6 billion, and those will be the discretionary dollars that are coming into the state. We have been told that our dollars are coming in two tranches. 50% will be distributed this year, and then the other 50% will be distributed a year later in 2022. And as you can see, the dollars that are going specifically out directly to the counties and the municipal cities, plus what is anticipated to go to the non-entitlement units equals around about $1 billion total. And so you can see the breakdown of some of those dollars there. Again, the anticipation here is that your dollars will also be coming out in 2 tranches based on the way that that determination was made. Is actually a state level determination based on, I believe it's had a relationship to our unemployment rates in the state across the time. And so we didn't have we couldn't request it or ask for it. It's how it was determined at the federal level. And we will be sharing the slides. They may already be posted, but they will be shared, as there are various links throughout that will be active links for you to utilize. The last piece is just as a reminder, that last bucket that's on this slide over to the right, that 2.3 billion, remembering that there are also state agencies, education, healthcare, childcare, housing, transportation, business, that also will be receiving dollars out of this relief bill. And those dollars may also be funneling in and to and through your region in different ways, on top of the state discretionary dollars and how those end up being parceled out through the Spark process, which we will be kicking back off shortly, as well as the dollars that are coming in to and through directly. So you can see roughly the discretionary dollars coming to the state are about 2.6 billion total between counties, cities, NEUs, and the state, and about 2.3 coming into direct programs and state agencies. With that, I'm actually going to pass it off to my colleague, Matt Hansen. He is a partner at Wood O'Brien with just decades of federal grant management experience. And he'll lead us through kind of some of the technical aspects in the rest of the webinar today, talking through pieces of the guidance and trying to answer many of your questions. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Secretary Burns-Wallace. Next slide. So over the next few slides, I will highlight a few themes and key clarifications from the recently released Treasury guidance. This is not going to be a deep dive into all of the guidance components, but instead a starting point for ongoing conversations. The good news is that we are in a much better position from a guidance perspective today than we were a year ago as it related to the CARES Act, CRF funds. As was mentioned earlier, last Monday, Treasury issued the interim final rule for the American Rescue Plan State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. This nice 151-page document is quite detailed and establishes the jumping off point for the distribution and administration of the state and local fiscal recovery funds. Unique to this process, as the Secretary mentioned, is that the interim final rule was issued without advance notice and the normal public comment period, so that the guidance could be used for the immediate implementation of the program. This does not mean that the interim final rule is final. Jurisdictions have until July 10th, 2021 to submit questions and comments. And I would strongly suggest you and your staffs take advantage of this opportunity to provide those comments and ask those questions of Treasury. The interim final rule is by far the most important document issued last week by Treasury, but it by no means was the only one. In addition, Treasury also issued a high-level fact sheet. This 8-page fact sheet should serve as a beneficial tool for gaining an overall understanding of the local fiscal recovery funds, as well as provide briefing materials for your elected leaders and other stakeholders. Treasury subsequently issued the first iteration of frequently asked questions related to these funds. The first 60 questions do a good job of explaining allowable activities, how to calculate revenue loss, and high-level reporting and administrative requirements. My understanding and belief is that these frequently asked questions will be added to over time, and similar to the CARES Act CRF funding, that the Treasury Office of Inspector General will also issue their own guidance materials related to reporting, document retention, and other compliance topics. The final guidance document released was a quick reference guide, probably the least valuable of the materials made available last week, but it is a highly formatted and polished document, so it should serve as convenient collateral to hand out at public meetings and also to be available to the general public on your jurisdiction's website so that they can better understand the local fiscal recovery funds. Links for all of these materials are available on the last slide of this presentation for your reference. In addition to the guidance materials made available by Treasury last week, they also released specific allocation information for states, counties, and major metropolitan cities. The allocation information for non-entitlement units of local government is still pending. We were hoping it would be out by today, but we do anticipate it being released any day now. Please note that all 105 of Kansas counties were included in the county allocations, and thus you will receive a direct allocation of funding from the Treasury and will need to submit a request to Treasury in order to receive this allocation. Additionally, 10 municipalities, we had anticipated 9, but it wound up being 10 municipalities in Kansas, were included in the allocations for metropolitan cities, and will also receive a direct allocation and will need to submit a request to Treasury. Please note that this webinar is only intended for those 105 counties and 10 metros who will need to submit a request directly to Treasury. The RO will hold a separate session for the non-entitlement communities at a later date once the allocations and specific guidance has been released. Just a note, there have been some discussions around the country about municipalities being labeled incorrectly as either a metropolitan city or a non-entitlement community, as well as conversations about allocations that seem to be in error. If your community believes you are experiencing one of these issues, my recommendation would be to not submit your request for funds yet, and instead email Treasury directly with your concerns. I know the associations are also working on some of these issues as well. Again, links for all of these materials, including the allocations, are on the next slide, or on the last slide of the presentation. Next slide, Micah. So as was discussed in the last webinar back in March, recipients of local fiscal recovery funds will have broad discretion on how to allocate these resources. As a starting point, generally if an activity was allowable under the CARES Act CRF program, it is allowable with these new funds. In the area of responding to public health emergency and its negative economic impacts, the most impactful section has to do with the provision of services to qualified census tracts. A qualified census tract includes any census tract or equivalent geographic area defined by the Bureau of Census, and in which at least 50% of households have an income less than 60% of the area median gross income, or which has a poverty rate of at least 25%. These qualified census tracts will be changing at some point based on the latest 2020 census data, but jurisdictions should use the most current mapping information available on the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's website. Why this is important information is within these areas, there is a presumption of eligibility, meaning no specific rationale or justification needs to be developed to implement projects in these areas. If using funds for other populations outside of these census tracts disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, recipients should be able to fully support the determination that the pandemic resulted in disproportionate public health or economic outcomes to the specific populations. Addressing projects in these areas creates additional allowable purposes of the funding, including things like lead paint abatement, lead in drinking water, but also additional infrastructure, public health, and economic development opportunities. So this is an area that your jurisdictions will want to explore in greater detail. And there's some really good mapping resources on HUD and some other websites that can drill down to your community and tell you if you specifically have qualified census tracts or communities that would meet those same criteria. The next update we received from Treasury guidance is related to the provision of premium pay. While higher wage earners are not precluded from participating, Treasury really intends that this funding be used for lower wage earners and those workers performing essential duties. So generally speaking, not a generic economic development tool, but more a direct response and recovery tool to the COVID pandemic. This does not mean that higher wage earners and industries with a lesser COVID nexus are not included, but jurisdictions will have to develop a specific rationale and document their approach for allocating funds to these individuals. What we also learned about the provision of premium pay is really intended for individuals who perform regular in-person work. So not really intended for those that telework or work remotely. Also, please note that the $25,000 limit on premium pay is per eligible worker over the life of the local fiscal recovery fund. and not an annual cap. I'm sure this will be a question asked of Treasury, so I would expect more guidance here going forward. A section of guidance that was widely anticipated is around revenue replacement. Widely anticipated. Treasury did provide a great deal of discretion and flexibility to allow governments to calculate as high a revenue loss as possible, including the use of a 4.1% growth adjustment. I'm not going to try and go through the calculations on this call. We could be here all afternoon, but would encourage everyone to review the frequently asked questions, and in particular questions 16 through 23 that provide great detail on the calculation methodology. What we do know about the use of revenue replacement funding is that it creates opportunities to fund infrastructure and other essential government services not directly related to COVID-19. The final allowable use category is infrastructure. When the American Rescue Plan Act language was released, many of us believed that the listing of water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure were just representative samples, but the guidance does confirm these limitations. Treasury has included stormwater into the mix, but the allowable uses of funding for infrastructure is relatively limited, unless, of course, you're taking advantage of either the qualified census tract provision or revenue replacement. Additionally, recipients of funding are being encouraged to coordinate with the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Water State Revolving Fund and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund when considering potential investments. On those websites, you can really see a specific list of eligible activities or eligible infrastructure investments you can make. The guidance did confirm that compliance items such as Davis-Bacon wage determinations and the National Environmental Policy Act do not apply to this funding, which is key to keeping the administrative burden at a minimum and to accelerate implementation. But Treasury does identify them as best practices that should be considered when implementing projects. Again, these are just a few highlights, but I strongly encourage jurisdictions to do a deep dive into the allowable activities before finalizing any spending plans. Next slide. The guidance also answered many administrative questions. Again, this presentation does not include information for non-entitlement units of local government, but the state of Kansas, 105 counties and metropolitan cities, as mentioned earlier, will all be receiving their funding in 2 tranches of 50% of the total allocation, 12 months apart. There are several guesses as to why Treasury is doing this, with one of them being a hedge against another wave of COVID next winter. But regardless, spending plans and timelines will have to factor in this disbursement methodology. One key piece of guidance relates to the obligation and expenditure of funding. This was a huge question mark for a long time with the CARES Act CRF funding, but we now know that funding only has to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, with the federal definition being obligation means orders placed for property and services, contracts and subawards made, and similar transactions during a given period that require payment by the non-federal entity during the same or a future period. So essentially, an obligation to make a payment or a commitment to make a payment is a definition of an obligation. The specific definition can be found in 2 CFR 200 or the Uniform Guidance if anyone needs to refer to it. Once obligated, a recipient then has an additional 2 years until December 31st, 2026 to fully expend the funding and liquidate the expense. This additional time should serve to be very beneficial for some longer-term infrastructure projects. As we all assumed, all direct recipients of state and local fiscal recovery funds, so everyone on this call, will have to submit quarterly project and expenditure reports. We believe this will look very similar to the CARES Act CRF reporting through the grantsolutions.gov portal, but we are expecting additional guidance from the Treasury Office of Inspector General regarding this. There will be an interim report for the period through July 31st, 2021, due to Treasury by August 31st, 2021, with subsequent reports covering each calendar quarter and due 30 days after the end of the quarter. The 30 days to submit reports is actually a big improvement. It oftentimes was 10 days or less with the CRF funding. New, however, to the fiscal recovery funds is a requirement for the states, counties, and metropolitan cities over 250,000 in population to submit a recovery plan performance report. The first of these reports is due August 31st as well, with subsequent reports due 30 days after each 12-month reporting period. These annual reports are intended to be different in that they will include project outcomes, performance indicators, and programmatic data. The design of these reports and the data that will be necessary from specific projects and subrecipients of funding is something that needs to be taken into consideration before awards are made and expenditures begin. Again, we are expecting additional guidance from the Treasury Office of Inspector General related to these reports soon. Finally, the last major highlight in Treasury guidance is that funds cannot be used to match any federal programs, including Stafford Act. This is a significant departure from the CARES Act CRF funding and something that jurisdictions will have to closely monitor. Throughout the guidance, there are numerous references to combining and or leveraging the local fiscal recovery funds for things like the Clean Drinking Water Revolving Fund, but this stops short of actually serving as an approved source of federal match. What is interesting is that this prohibition also applies to the revenue replacement funds, where governments might not have the ability to provide match due to declining revenues. This will certainly be an area where we will look for additional clarification as the interim final rule is being considered. Next slide. Last Monday, Treasury also opened the process for submitting a request for funds for the states, counties, and metropolitan cities who will receive their funding directly from Treasury. As was mentioned earlier, guidance and allocations pertaining to non-entitlement communities who will receive their funding through the state is still pending. Before applying to Treasury, we would recommend that you review your allocation and your city's designation as a metropolitan community. As mentioned, there have been some concerns. You should make sure that you're comfortable with everything before submitting your request. Work through your associations, as there's not much the state can do to influence the allocation or change your designation. Those that have already submitted their request have indicated that the system, the Treasury system, is somewhat clunky and temperamental. Therefore, we encourage you to assemble all the following pieces of information before starting the process. As mentioned in previous communications, you will need to have a copy of your taxpayer ID number, along with your Data Universal Numbering System, or DUNS number. Next, you will need to make sure that your jurisdiction is currently registered with the System for Award Management, or SAM.gov, and that your jurisdiction's profile is both active and publicly available. Registering for the first time or renewing your expired SAM.gov registration can take several weeks, so this is something you should work on as soon as possible. Decisions will also need to be made about who will be serving as the authorized representative and contact person for your jurisdiction. From firsthand experience working with Treasury, these are items that are easy to establish in the beginning, but quite difficult to update or change with Treasury later on. So it merits some time and attention to make sure you get these roles and responsibilities correct from the beginning. You also need to have complete contact information for each individual as well. The next item you will need is banking and wiring information for your jurisdiction. If you ultimately want this funding to hit a specific bank account, you should determine that up front. You will also want to confirm that there are no wiring limitations on your account, such as not to exceed X amount in a single transaction or in a daily transaction. We're talking about sums of money that our organizations don't usually have wired to us. So you should check that, as any wiring limitations could delay or even prevent your transfer from Treasury. Finally, you will want to complete the certification document offline before starting the request process. There is some electronic signature and other unique requirements that have been a challenge for some individuals when trying to complete the form, while also at the same time submitting the request in the system. Once ready, the link is available on the slide. Please know that Treasury uses ID.me for identity management. Not a major obstacle, but just something to be aware of, as ID.me does have capacity issues and other problems from time to time. A lot of jurisdictions are now using ID.me for validating recipients of unemployment insurance. So that website, that resource is getting hit by thousands of individuals, minute by minute. So just be aware that there could be a delay in submitting your request. The final two items on this slide are two email accounts the Treasury has made available. So far, we have seen good results from the COVID relief support email account, as they've been very responsive. So I would encourage you to contact them directly if you run into any problems with the request process. Next slide. So I'm sure there's numerous guidance related questions, and we'll have time at the end of the session to hopefully answer a number of those. However, we would like to transition to the support that the Office of Recovery will be providing related to the implementation of the local fiscal recovery funds. With the exception of a few counties, the biggest change with the local fiscal recovery funds is that all 105 counties and 10 metropolitan cities are now direct recipients from Treasury. The American Rescue Plan Act funding does not establish a subrecipient or pass-through relationship between the state and local governments like the CARES Act CRF funding did. Because of this, all of the compliance and oversight responsibilities required of a subrecipient or pass-through relationship by the state go away. The Office of Recovery does not have a requirement to do risk assessment, make allowability decisions, collect reports, etc. in a direct manner. The RO, however, will still be supporting local governments with these functions, but this support will be through webinars, FAQs, and collateral materials versus direct service delivery or staff augmentation. As Secretary Burns-Wallace mentioned earlier, the RO is committed to being a partner throughout this process. Another big change will be the move from a single RO representative who is assigned to support the counties to a more comprehensive RO team approach. In the beginning, there will be at least 5 individuals providing materials and support for the local governments, including the non-entitlement communities, which should make for faster turnarounds and a better customer service experience, with plans to ramp this up as needed throughout the life of these funds. In order to facilitate this team approach, the RO will be moving away from a dedicated email account to an inquiry form, which will allow for the entire team to monitor for submissions and also facilitate better tracking and more timely responses. To spend just a few additional minutes on what the support will look like going forward, there will be 2 local government liaisons working directly for the Recovery Office. These liaisons will provide coordination with the major stakeholder organizations and be critical to responding to the resource needs of the counties and cities. The 2 local government liaisons will be supported by 3 consultant local government support resources. These 3 resources will be positioned differently than the technical assistance representatives, or TAs, that existed with the CARES Act CRF Spark funds. Instead of regional assignments, these resources will be assigned specific functional areas. The first resource will focus on developing regular webinars and communication resources to be delivered to local governments and other interested stakeholders. The second one will stand up an E311, or frequently asked question process, using the inquiry form mentioned before. Responses to these questions will stop short of actually performing any sort of risk or allowability assessment, but we will direct you to available resources when available. As these questions come in, they will also inform future webinar topics and other services that the RO will deliver in the future. The third resource will focus on developing and delivering collateral materials, such as sample documents and templates that you will be able to leverage for your jurisdictions. I'll go into greater detail about many of these items on the next slide, but before we move on, I want to address additional audit and compliance support, or even staff augmentation resources that local governments might need. The Office of the Recovery is in the process of finalizing a shared services contract vehicle where local governments will be able to procure for services such as accountants and auditors without the time and expense normally associated with a request for proposals or other procurement action. Next slide. So just to expand on the previous slide a little bit, and to provide a better visual and timeline expectations, I'd like to go through each of the RO resources that will be made available. The first is the website, which will be your key starting point. The Recovery Office has been going through and updating the website to transition from being dedicated to the CARES Act CRF funding to now include the ARPA, State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund information as well. The Office of Recovery has also been working with other state agencies to make sure that all of the state's websites are in alignment and will provide the relevant content and information. The RO website is currently available, and I would encourage you to begin accessing this resource right away. The next item is the inquiry form, which has been previously discussed. This form will replace the various group and personal email accounts and will be released this week, so please look for that announcement and start using that form to seek additional guidance. Ongoing communications will be a major component of the RO's support going forward. These regular and consistent email communications will announce upcoming webinars, identifying best practices, updates to Treasury guidance, highlight reporting deadlines, and most importantly, opportunities for state, county, and city governments to partner on key initiatives. These emails are listed as monthly, but will likely be more frequent in the beginning and then back off over time. Regular webinars will be held bi-weekly, but the focus will change dramatically from what the counties might have experienced with the previous regional webinars. Since the purpose of the webinars will not be communicating specific compliance or reporting requirements required as a subrecipient, the webinars going forward for the local fiscal recovery funds will address in-depth guidance analysis, compliance and reporting best practices, areas of need, and collaboration opportunities. These webinars will be greatly informed by the types of inquiries we receive through the inquiry form. As an example, if there are lots of questions about doing needs assessments, then we'll develop a webinar addressing that topic as quickly as possible. Job aids and templates will be made available wherever possible. There are now 56 states and territories, along with thousands of counties, cities, and tribal governments, all administering the same pot of money and having to implement the same internal controls and compliance procedures. It makes no sense for each jurisdiction to uniquely develop these materials, so the RO will share templates such as needs assessment, duplication of benefit playbooks, risk assessment, monitoring guides, etc., wherever possible. The plan is to start releasing these collateral materials in mid-June and then have a regular ongoing cadence of releases. Finally, as was mentioned before, the RO realizes that some jurisdictions will need additional support up to and including direct staff augmentation. To facilitate this, the RO is in the process of establishing a shared services contract vehicle that will allow local governments to quickly and easily select from a listing of pre-approved consultants to provide services such as audit and compliance support, grants management, and direct staff augmentation. This contract vehicle should be available for use by late June. These are unprecedented times when it comes to the administration of federal financial assistance, and the RO knows this plan will likely need to adjust over time and looks forward to working with you to make sure that Kansas is able to maximize these resources. Next slide. So the communicating of best practices will be a major focus of the work the RO does over the coming months. As many of us wait for our first tranche of funding, we would like to identify just a few best practices that local governments should be considering. With the American Rescue Plan Act funding, there are several different dynamics going on simultaneously. The first one has to do with state and local fiscal recovery funds, with 3 distinct layers of government all receiving funding at the same time, and the need to coordinate who is doing what and when. So states receiving money, counties receiving money, cities are receiving money, and how do we coordinate that activity? The second dynamic is that outside of these funds, state and local governments are getting subject-specific dollars directly as well. The need to understand all the dollars being made available for education, healthcare, housing, broadband, etc., will be crucial in informing the investments of both the state and the local fiscal recovery funds. To that end, it is a recommended best practice to conduct a very structured project prioritization process. This process should begin with a complete understanding of the allowable uses of fund and how things like the 2 tranches of funding might impact potential projects. Jurisdictions should also review existing programs to see which ones are already receiving direct allocations and which ones might need the investment of local fiscal recovery funds in order to be sustained. Communities should be identifying unmet needs, which might include something like administering a community needs assessment survey or holding a series of stakeholder engagement sessions to cast as broad a net as possible. There will be instances when staff just already knows what the needs are, and others where additional public engagement will be critical. Additionally, as local governments identify internal resources to manage this process and/or bring in consultants, there is one resource we would like to bring to your attention. The Bloomberg Cities Network is a partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies and major cities across the country to respond to COVID-19 and better understand how the American Rescue Plan Act dollars can be deployed. This website offers lots of helpful information about potential scenarios that your county or city might also be facing. So the website's on the slide. It's a free resource. There's a lot of incredible content there. So please, by all means, access that resource. In addition to project funding prioritization, local governments should also be looking for opportunities for collaboration and partnership. This might include sharing information or resource partners, but also could include pooling financial resources to accomplish a shared goal. This is an area that you and your organizations work on every day, so I won't belabor the point, but having specific points of contact with decision-making authority, establishing new partnerships, or managing and reinvesting in existing partnerships with community-based organizations, and engaging with your fellow government organizations and colleagues will all be critical. Finally, and probably most importantly for those of you who do not routinely manage direct federal funds, it will be very important to focus on operational issues. The first step will be identifying or even establishing the organizational structure required to administer these funds. Unlike the last round of funding, which was essentially 9 months long, this funding will be around for at least 4 years. So taking the time to invest in the structure that will be capable of being maintained for that amount of time will be crucial. In addition to having the ability to manage the funding internally as a direct recipient, you will now have the added responsibility to have to monitor and oversee your subrecipients. This will be required both from a compliance perspective, but also now for reporting purposes. The ability to effectively monitor subrecipients begins with the initial agreements that are put in place, and the RO will try and assist with this process through webinar trainings and templated materials. Next slide. So could spend all day on guidance and best practices, but in order to get to a couple questions, we'll discuss next steps. The 105 counties and 10 municipalities participating in this call should review the materials provided today and continue your review and understanding of all the recently released Treasury guidance. Once your jurisdiction is comfortable with the specific designation and allocation amount, you should go ahead and submit your funding request to Treasury. While waiting on your first disbursement, your budget and accounting staff should calculate your jurisdiction's revenue loss, if applicable, as having that number will inform your ability to take advantage of the greater programmatic flexibility afforded by the provision of government services. At the same time, your entity should be conducting some sort of needs assessment and crosswalk those needs with the allowability provisions of the Treasury guidance to see if they are potentially an allowable use. In parallel, your organization should identify or stand up the organizational structure that will be necessary to manage these funds and administer them for an extended period of time. This will include items such as the establishment of internal controls, file retention requirements, and documentation of funding decisions and allowability rationales, which might include the creation of specific local fiscal recovery fund policies and procedures manuals. This is a significant undertaking and one that some jurisdictions will need to add additional staff and/or contractual support in order to accomplish. Finally, continue to engage with the Office of Recovery, subscribe to ongoing communications, participate in future webinars, and use the inquiry form to ask questions and provide the RO feedback on additional resources that might be helpful. And with that, I will pause to see if Secretary Burns-Wallace has any additional comments she would like to make before opening up the session for questions.
Thank you so much, Matt. Again, I just want to reiterate that we are all going through this together. What I will say is, as you all start to ask questions, we are still asking them ourselves as we have to manage the state discretionary dollars. But the questions are important because, as you can see, it will drive a lot of the engagement we have with the federal level, as well as resources and answers we try to get across the board for all of the entities that are impacted. With that, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. Matt, are you going to field? There's a few that are in the chat, and I don't know if they've been addressed before we open it up more broadly. Who's managing questions?
I have not looked at them as I was talking,
Okay.
but I'll start looking at them now.
No problem. The first one is an easy one. It asked about the slides and recordings. Everything will be posted and circulated. There was a question about what is the deadline for counties requesting their allocation. And I believe the question is around the counties requesting their allocation from the Treasury. Is there a deadline per se?
Not per se. So the counties have some time, to get organized and prepared before submitting their request. There are some other programs within ARPA, like the Homeowners Assistance Fund, where there were specific lines: if you didn't apply, you don't receive your money, but not with the state and local fiscal recovery funds.
Okay, great. There is a question regarding SB 273. What I can say is that this bill is under review by the governor. So the next question, there was a question about dates for the first report. Can we make sure that we, in some of the material, I don't know if it was actually in there, can we make sure that we make sure those dates are clear, at least the dates we know as of right now? Do you know those? You must have mentioned them earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, there's a catch-up report for both the quarterly and the annual. Essentially, August 31st is the first major reporting deadline. We have a good table with all the reporting information that we'll add to the slide deck before we post, so people can refer to it.
Perfect. Will counties with populations less than 250,000 be required to submit recovery plan performance report?
It is my understanding that all counties are required and only cities over 250,000, but I will double check and we'll include it in that reporting table.
Okay. This is a question about establishing bank accounts for the funds. It says, will we have to establish bank accounts for these funds that cannot gain interest like the last round of funds?
For the state receiving this funding, the Federal Cash Management Improvement Act applies, and there's specific guidance on what states need to do with managing interest and repayments to the feds and everything. It's an outstanding question we have for counties and local governments. The guidance you're referring to is specific guidance that the state of Kansas applied on the Spark funding, and not necessarily generically on the federal funding. But that is an outstanding question on interest handling that we need to get more information on.
Okay.
I generally was saying you do not need to set up a unique bank account. It can route into your regular bank account. It's how you handle any interest that we need more clarification on.
So there's a question, as you were talking through and talking about the responsible parties, someone mentioned that it's, many counties change board chairs every year. And so it can be difficult to change who's responsible as the responsible party later. So is there a recommendation in who should be, who they should designate as a signatory?
My experience is, most federal agencies, and include Treasury, get busy, and you'll submit a request to update contact information, and it sometimes doesn't happen very quickly. So if there's a county administrator or, permanent staff that's authorized to serve as the certifying official, I would encourage you to do that. It's not impossible to change. It's just, it just takes some time. So whoever has the ability to be designated as your certifying official, if that can be a permanent county staff employee, that would be preferred.
Our county has both corps and federal land. I saw that there was a different set of money set aside for that land. How do we apply for that? Matt, do you have a background there?
I do not.
Okay. Trish, I'm gonna ask, we'll grab your name and if we can connect with you and see if we can point you in the direction of some good guidance or add that question to a larger list and get some context. Are there any other members of our team that are on that have any background in this area? All right. I'm not hearing none, so we'll do a follow-up there. All right, let's see. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Did another one come in? Yeah, okay. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Are there other questions? Please drop them in the chat. I don't know that you can unmute your mics. I think that is controlled. But if you can drop them in the chat or let us know you have a question, and then I can ask our moderators to unmute your mic so that you can ask that question. I don't know if our raise hand feature is active. Team, are there other questions?
I just looked up the reporting question. It is counties over 250,000 have the annual reporting requirement.
Okay, so counties under 250 do not have to submit the recovery plan performance report.
Correct.
So counties and cities under 250,000.
Do not, correct.
Do not, okay. And we'll make sure to add that to the table just as a clarifying point.
Yep.
Okay. How can we get more information on the capital improvements fund? That is still pending, is it not? They did not give additional information in the guidance, Matt?
Treasury updated the Capital Improvements Fund website last Monday as well. There's 2 or 3 paragraphs of information, but really no guidance, no application process. They are tipping their hand quite a bit that the focus of the capital improvement program is going to be very much broadband infrastructure and not more generic infrastructure. But there are a couple paragraphs on the website that you could review.
When will audit compliance requirements be known?
We know some of them, unlike the CARES Act CRF, where only 5 provisions of the uniform guidance applied. With the state and local fiscal recovery funds, essentially all of the uniform guidance provisions apply. But other audit and compliance requirements won't be known until the 2021 compliance supplement is issued.
So more to come there. Question, would the deadlines for the 2024 and 2026 prohibit the funds to be used for a revolving loan fund beyond those dates?
That's a question I would encourage you to ask directly of Treasury. My initial reaction is anything that went beyond the 2026 deadline to expend and liquidate the funding would be problematic. But I think that's a question best answered by Treasury.
Question back on the Capital Improvement Fund. Do you think the application will be made to the federal government directly or to the state? If I'm not mistaken, isn't the Capital Improvement Fund, isn't it one application per state to access the dollars? Am I remembering that correctly, Matt?
That's my interpretation of the language they have on their website, that each state will put together, a single application to submit. So therefore, if locals were applying, they would be looking to the state for funding.
Got it. What I will say is I know that our Office of Broadband is doing some work in this space and looking to do some statewide collaboration. And I think once we get a few more details on the capital improvement plan application, that you'll hear from them more broadly about looking for those partners and how we can leverage these dollars and others' dollars in a statewide collaboration. So I would say more to come there. Any other questions? Or again, I'm not sure. Micah, are the mics locked? Can people unmute themselves?
People can unmute themselves if they'd like to at this point.
Thank you. So mics are unmuted. You can unmute yourself. If you do have a question, you're welcome to continue to type it. We have a few more minutes left. What I will say is we will continue to entertain questions in the chat. I will take a question or two if someone wants to unmute and ask a question. But most importantly, remember, we will be circulating the PowerPoint. We are recording the webinar as well. There are a lot of active links in the PowerPoint and additional materials we will attach to it. So please check those out. We will also let you all know when the inquiry form is up later this week as a way to send in other questions. But I encourage you to share the materials, both the PowerPoint when you receive it, as well as a link to the video with others in your community that'll be a part of thinking about and managing these dollars. So any final questions? Feel free to open your mic and introduce yourselves. Have you heard a timeline on SB 270 reviewed by the governor? I don't have a timeline, but there is a window in relationship to bills in which any review has to happen before they move into law. If I'm in any of my legislative people can chime in there if I've outlined that.
There's a 10-day window for the governor to review bills that she's received.
All right. So we are in that 10-day window.
Yeah, it was enrolled on the 14th. So we are in that window.
There we go. Stay tuned. Any other questions? All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Oh, here's one real quick for the revenue loss criteria. Matt, it sounds like it's for you. Do these funds have to be spent on the other categories within the ruling, or can it be used for operations?
And that's one of the keys about calculating revenue replacement, is it opens up a whole window of additional allowable purposes. So it says for the provision of government services, which could include regular government operations, police, fire, courts, without a direct COVID nexus.
Okay. Any other questions? Please know again, as they come up, you may digest the information, additional questions. Please feel free to send those in. That's what we're here for. And we will field as many as we can and continue to find answers. We are at the top of the hour. I want to be mindful of people's time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a partner in this. Thank you for working hard to make sure that we can leverage these dollars for Kansans in the best way possible. So please stay tuned. More information to come. We will be sharing what we know and what we have and trying to help you get the most accurate and timely information. So with that, we will sign off. We will stay on. I'll ask my team to stay on for a few minutes in case anybody has any follow-ups, but thank you for joining us this afternoon.